Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters. As if the world doesn't have enough conflict to deal with, Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro is threatening to annex a part of neighbouring Guyana. It seems Maduro has his eyes fixed on recently found oil reserves, all possibly in an attempt to improve his flagging popularity at home. We're joined by Joe Daniels from the Financial Times, a regular contributor to our tools, our expert there in the region. Hello and welcome, Joe.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're good. You've just got back from Guyana, haven't you?
Yeah, I got back yesterday morning.
And since you left, something happened. There was a meeting in which I can't remember which Caribbean island it was, which Caribbean state it was,
It was St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
And the upshot of that was, I mean, basically over the last few weeks, there really has been a lot of saber rattling and real concern that Venezuela, we know there was a referendum, I think on December the 3rd, but before that, a significant amount of saber rattling going on.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the saber rattling has really been kind of ramped up since 2015, and large discoveries of oil were made by ExxonMobil off the coast of Guyana. But Venezuela has long kind of claimed the region known as the Essequibo. Children are taught in school that the Venezuelan map actually extends that far. They call it the reclamation zone to be reclaimed.
I've actually, because now you mentioned, I've actually got the. So we have to show. I'm going to bring up the first map to show where Guyana is. Can everyone see that? Can you see that there? Yeah, there we go. So in green is Guyana. Can you see that, Joe?
I can see that. Yeah,
in Venezuela in orange. Yeah, and Essequibo is huge.
Yeah, it's massive. It's 100. How big is it? How big is it? It's I think 63,000 square miles. 62,000 square miles, I believe. 160,000 kilometers.
So give us a comparison.
It's the size of Greece or Tunisia or England, Wales, and Scotland, but not Northern Ireland.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge, and it's sparsely populated. Only 125,000 people live there. It's largely bush, rainforest, some shrublands, mangroves, and there's lots of minerals in it, like under its soil, gold, diamonds, bauxite, maybe even uranium. But it's largely untapped. It's pretty Wild West. And then off the coast of it is where you've got the Stabroek Block, which is where Exxon found at least proven 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent.
Let me show you the new Venezuelan map. I don't know how new it is, but it's certainly new to the rest of the world. Hang on. So this is the new Venezuelan map with the coastline, but that large section to the right, sort of coming down and stretching all the way up to the coast, is Essequibo.
Yes, exactly. It's 2/3 of Guyana's landmass.
How that 11 billion? I think that's the world's biggest oil reserves found in recent something like 30 years.
Something like that, maybe longer. It's huge. It's deep underwater, like deep under. It's obviously under the seabed. And it's about, how far off is it? It's a good like 100 kilometers offshore, and they've only just started really. I mean, they're exploring every day. They're already producing 360,000 barrels a day. They started producing in 2019, so they found it in 2015, and then 2019 they started producing, and it's. They predict. Where are my notes? I was with the finance minister 2 days ago. They think that by 2027, 1.2 million barrels a day.
So that's going to have a colossal impact, isn't it? I mean, just tell us about Guyana as a state, for example. I mean, it's poor, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's very poor. It was by most metrics until around the discovery of oil, it was the second poorest country in the Americas after Haiti. It's desperately poor. There's very little infrastructure. I mean, it's a small country. I mean, it's land-wise, it's quite big, but population-wise, it's 800,000 people. It's bizarre because it's on mainland South America, but it's certainly not Latin America. It feels more like the Caribbean. Everyone speaks English or like a English-based patois. It's kind of old wooden houses. All the it's got the same kind of ethnic makeup as a lot of the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, with kind of Afro communities, Indian communities, and Amerindian communities. But also it's different from that because it has a frontier. It's kind of like Australia in that sense, which has like the bush that you can go into work, and mine for gold or diamonds or whatever.
So huge amounts of potentially unexplored territory that has ownership as well. I mean, I saw there was an uprising from finca owners or sort of rancheros who at one stage had a rebellion against the state.
Yes, it's land, like in a lot of Latin America, is often kind of it was originally plantations, sugar plantations. It's where Demerara sugar comes from, or Demerara, I think is the Demerara River runs alongside Georgetown, the capital.
Okay, so the economic impact would be colossal. I'm just going to share another map there. So how long does this dispute? I mean, we're going to get onto the politics of it in a moment, but I think it's important to mention Guyana's colonial history, where it comes from, who founded it, if you like, and where that dispute has its origins. And I'll just bring up the map of British Guyana, which is just here.
There it is.
You got it? I don't know. Is that working? Yeah.
I can see. Yes, British Guyana. So before that, in the Spanish laid claim to it before, and then following Venezuelan independence, some years later, during international arbitration, which took place in 1899, between Russia, the US acting on behalf of Venezuela, which Maduro doesn't mention when he says that it was decided by the US. Like, yes, but because Venezuela wanted the US to represent them at the time, and Russia. So that was the boundary that the boundary was set through the jungle. And Venezuela at the time was very happy with it because that meant that Venezuela got the Orinoco River and the basin around it, which has a lot of gold there. And so at the time, this was settled. When you speak to the Guyanese now, and you speak to the people in government and the people that are arguing the case, the lawyers at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, they will say that this is not a border dispute; it's a controversy. There's no dispute. It was settled in 1899. There are stamps, Venezuelan stamps from then on, saying that they agreed to it, blah, blah, blah. And it's in 1962 that Venezuela went back started to renege on that and regarded it as an unsettled claim. And
Guyana gets independence in '66, and then I guess they can see that Guyana's becoming independent, so that's the time to sort of lodge a bit of a claim. But really, there's not a huge amount of noise about it, obviously, until the oil prospecting starts in 2011, and then the major discovery, the huge reserves unfold in 2015. But let's bring it up to what's been happening more recently. I'm going to talk about the referendum, or we're going to talk about the referendum that took place at the beginning of this month in a moment. But how has Maduro been ratcheting that tension up? It's only in the last couple of years, since 2021, really.
Yes. Well, it has just been with sort of rhetoric more than anything. There's been some in 2001. There was a sort of the Venezuelans sort of intercepted a fuel exploration vessel that caused a hoo-ha. But generally speaking, they've not been anywhere near the ratcheting up. Really went into overdrive this year, we'll talk about it in a second, but that's to do with internal politics in Venezuela. And
I mean, how serious was it? I mean, give us an idea in terms of the deployment of armed forces. And you talked about some ships being intercepted in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. But was there a real threat? I mean, were they actually sort of doing maneuvers on the border? Was there a realistic possibility of military action?
You mean up until yesterday?
Yeah.
Well, there was build up on the border, but not a lot. I'd heard that there was from people there that there were around 40 amphibious vehicles that have been put there, some troop build up, but nowhere near enough troops to launch an invasion.
Yeah. And it's colossal. It's a massive area, isn't it? So any sort of military intervention would be, I mean, it's hard to sort of figure out what it would achieve.
Yes, I mean, I was speaking with the former chief of staff of the Guyanese Defence Forces, and which is a force of 4,000 people, and including reservists. And he was saying that the only way, if he were to do it, if he were a Venezuelan general, would be to go via the sea, to go up the coast and then along the Essequibo River, and then launch it from that, going that way. Because going across land, there's no roads on that border between Venezuela and Guyana. There's no roads. You'd have the only paved road that goes through the jungle from Venezuela into Guyana goes through Brazil, which is why Brazil deployed troops to the border. I mean, obviously Brazil's massive as the regional hegemon. It borders both those countries. It had to shut that door just in case.
Yeah. I read that was the only place that actually there were roads and you actually could move troops over, but you'd have to invade Brazil and then into Guyana too.
And that's a very different prospect to invading Guyana.
Yeah. So it does seem. I mean, we'll get to the fundamental reasons in a second. So that's the sort of saber rattling. This is what we're going to do militarily. Then Maduro announces this referendum, and I guess that's the clever bit.
Yes. Well, so the referendum, as can be viewed through two kind of lenses. The first is internationally, as a kind of almost Putin-esque way of legitimizing any action militarily he might make to annex the Essequibo. So you have
the will of the people and all that.
Yeah. But and again, I repeat, like Venezuelans consider it just a self-evident truth that the Essequibo is Venezuela. The opposition in Venezuela and Maduro and the Chavistas agree on that. They don't agree on how to kind of stake their claim, but they agree on the premise of it. But the other way, and in many ways, according to most kind of analysts and watchers, is that this whole brouhaha needs to be kind of looked at through the lens of what's going on in Venezuela. Venezuela will hold elections in the second half of next year. Maduro, if he wants, how can I order this best? Maduro has been obviously in power since Chavez died in 2013. He's overseen the collapse of the economy. Venezuela is the world's largest has the world's largest oil reserves, or proven oil reserves. Used to pump around 3 million barrels a day at the turn of the century. Now it only pumps about 700,000. It's due to mismanagement, corruption, and of course, US-led sanctions. And the US relieved sanctions on the oil sector, the gold sector, and on secondary bond markets in October, in order to entice Maduro into holding a more free and fair election. That's very kind of.
And so, in the payback for lifting sanctions is this.
Well, so and this is what Maduro kind of does: is he tests things. So, like now he knows. Okay, I can threaten to annex neighboring Guyana, and they still won't put sanctions back on. It's a trial balloon, and now he that allows him also. This whole thing has allowed him to take momentum away from the opposition. So what also is happening at the same time? The opposition held a primary on its own because the government wouldn't back it. So it held it on its own, and it almost unanimously, in a complete landslide, 93% of the vote went to Maria Corina Machado, an opposition leader who is largely untainted by a lot of the corruption that has sort of kind of swashed around the option.
A quick question there, but before you tell us a bit more about her, is how many people took part in that? Because that would be a critical thing, because that would give you an idea of how big your opposition is, your voting opposition is.
2.4 million people voted. In a country of 28 million now, an electorate of around 20 million. But bear in mind that this was organised without any state apparatus, so they weren't allowed to use any. Normally, obviously, you go to schools and things would be voting centres. They weren't. They couldn't do that. The opposition had to organise it entirely themselves, entirely privately. And of course, the government, Maduro, was meddling. There were weird power outages in certain places.
That's a fairly impressive figure.
In Venezuelan terms, that's a big number. And the fact that almost all of those votes went to her, he didn't like. And so in the referendum, which was partly the referendum was just an attempt to kind of get out the vote, to test the infrastructure of Chavismo and how it's doing. And by that metric, it was it was considered a bit of a failure. It was a bit embarrassing. On voting day, on December 3rd of the referendum, the polling centres were largely empty. The only time that there were queues reported were when it was soldiers lining up to vote. So, and then when the government comes out later and says 10 million people voted, it raised some eyebrows. That's more people than voted for Chavez. So, probably not that. No one knows what the actual number is, but presumably it's rather low. So that was a bit of an issue, a bit embarrassing for Maduro. Though what the referendum did do is allow him to further divide the opposition. They summarily arrested some of Maria Corina Machado's campaign aides because they were apparently plotting to undermine the referendum or something. And another thing that's important to add about Maria Corina is she's actually banned from holding office. She can't run in the election next year. The US has said unless she's allowed to run, all bans on candidates are lifted, they will reinstate sanctions. Maduro said, there's a process in which she can appeal to the Supreme Court, which is government controlled, in order to have that ban lifted. She says she's not going to do that because her ban's illegitimate in the first place. Anyway, that's getting a bit inside baseball. The point is, Maduro is clearly very concerned about Maria Corina Machado. She's a hardliner. She's called for his arrest before. She's obviously moderated since becoming the leader of the opposition, but for a long time she's been one of the more hardline, less conciliatory with Maduro. So he's going to be concerned that if somehow she takes office, that's curtains for him. He could go to jail forever or worse. There's less of a kind of golden parachute there with her. Okay,
so that's a serious opposition figure. What happened to the previous opposition figure who was recognized as winning the elections by the US?
Juan Guaido. So he was the leader of the National Assembly at the time in early 2019, which was by the order of Venezuela's succession. That made him, in the eyes of the US and 50 other countries, including the UK, the Venezuela's legitimate president, because they considered the office of president vacant due to the fraudulent 2018 election of Maduro, re-election of Maduro. Guaido was able to stay in Venezuela for a while, but then earlier this year he fled to the US, and he's now living in exile. There's an arrest warrant for him if he returns.
So really, he's not, without being in Venezuela and fighting the fight, he's disappeared from view to a degree. He's lost that political impact.
Exactly. I mean, that's once a Venezuelan goes into exile, they're kind of toast. Even more so when their chosen place of exile is Miami.
Okay. So if we come back to the border dispute, what's your reckoning? Do you think that that this is it served its purpose? Maduro's been to Guyana before. He's met with Guyanan leaders to discuss this very issue. So it's not as though that hasn't been done before.
Yes. So, so they met yesterday in St. Vincent. They agreed not to use force and to continue talking and not to escalate tensions, take any action that would escalate tensions. But of course, Maduro is a serial welcher on anything he agrees to, is the first thing to say. The second is that they will keep talking, but the Guyanese have been very clear that they don't consider this a dispute. They do not see, they're not talking about that. So when I met with Guyanese officials, including the vice president, who is also the governing party chairman, he was telling me that we're neighbours. We have lots of things to talk about that aren't just this. So they could talk about that. It's also, I think, just a bit of summitry. But the general mood in the street in Guyana and in the opposition and in academia, et cetera, in civil society, is that Guyanese President Irfan Ali should not have gone to this meeting. Just by taking the meeting, he kind of legitimizes Maduro's claim. They're very annoyed about that. I mean, since last night's announcement that there will be no use of force, I imagine they're also quite relaxed, a little bit more relieved. But they're in his claim.
I don't know if it's gone.
Sorry?
Got the signal at my end breaking up a bit, so I don't know. But carry on.
Sure, but yeah, so. It will continue to be a thing. This will be whipped up every time it serves Maduro to do so. Next time it looks like the opposition's got some momentum, or Maria Corina Machado's got some momentum. This is an easy way to just divert all attention onto that, sap out any kind of tailwind that the opposition has, or whatever the issue is that he wants to distract from. It's obviously going to drum up nationalism. And he can use it to try and exact sanctions from the US, it seems, to try and sanctions relief from the US, it seems, if he kind of holds Guyana over the barrel. There's various things that come into his calculations. The dispute and Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo isn't going anywhere. I don't think that they'll actually move on it. I mean, the only way I personally like... The calculus I see where Maduro might make a move on it is really if his back is very much against the wall. And it's not been for a while. He's buffoonish, he's clownish, but he's been in power for 10 years and he doesn't really look like he's going anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, we'll talk about more about Venezuela in just a second, but staying with the dispute, I mean, a couple of things struck me. Brazil seemed very, very worried about this. What do you think their primary concerns were? I mean, it seemed to me that the whole of South America moved in to make very sure that there wasn't going to be some kind of conflict. But Brazil in particular, were they too sensitive about the US exerting more control there? What do you think Brazil's motivations are?
Well, Brazil doesn't want a hot war on its border. First off, that would be a nightmare for Brazil. Lula sees himself as a kind of regional statesman and is always keen to kind of mediate these sorts of things. That goes way back from his previous term in office too. There is also a sense of there's between Brazil and the US, there is a very low-level, quiet rivalry. That is there. I mean, Brazil is growing. It's one of the best performing economies in the region, and it's also sort of nearshoring and all of that. So Brazil, definitely doesn't want anything that would destabilize the region. It would mess completely with its own projects. And I mean, Petrobras is one of the biggest, the Brazil state oil major, is one of the big investors, and they'll surely be having a look at some of those new licenses that are going up for auction in Guyana.
Okay, and one final question on that dispute: Russia's hope of getting anything out of it at all. I mean, there was some talk about Wagner mercenaries going along and helping Venezuelans out and stuff like that.
Yeah, Russia's kind of sly hand is often involved in things going on in Venezuela. Caracas is a key ally of Moscow in the region. But I mean, I'm no expert on Russia or its ambitions or how it goes about pursuing them. But the general consensus appears to be that anything that kind of causes a headache for the US is good for Russia, and this dispute definitely caused a headache for the US.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's have a quick, brief recap of what's going on in Venezuela. I mean, you have taken, when we've done tours with you, there have been, if you go back about 3-4 years ago, significant numbers of Venezuelans crossing the border, trying to get any currency they can, people really struggling to feed themselves. Has the economy stabilized at all since then? And if so, how and why?
The economy somewhat stabilized briefly, largely due to the relaxation of currency controls, tacit dollarization without ever becoming official, but just allowing dollars to circulate and business to be done in dollars inside Venezuela. That led to a lot more kind of commerce, and the economy began to grow. Although the US has only just lifted its major sanctions, other countries have kind of cozied up to Venezuela a bit more. Colombia is obviously a key trade partner for Venezuela, and Colombia elected its first leftist and ideological ally of Maduro last August. He took office, and one of his first actions was to reopen the border that had been shut amid the 2019 US-led maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. So that's also helped bring some dollars into the government there, and it's also the other thing is it's a vast country with a lot of illegal economies that kind of operate completely intertangled with the legitimate economy. So that also allows more money to circulate around. But all that said, this year it's got worse again. Inflation is now, on the first 11 months of the year, running at 184%. The shortages are being reported again. Public sector workers, which are previously a kind of bastion of Maduro and Chavista support, have been ebbing. There have been protests from them. So all is not well. I mean, 7 million people have left, and it's more Venezuelans crossing the Darien Gap than any other nationality. They're still leaving. They're still voting with their feet.
The Darien Gap being the peninsula, the land connection between Central America and South America.
Exactly, yes, on the border of Colombia and Panama. So yeah, the numbers there of Venezuelans crossing on foot is up. The economy of Venezuela is not well. It is predicted to do much better. They actually published their budget, and it's already allowing for, I think, 10% more than the previous year, and I've seen also from independent economists that sanctions relief could be worth 10% of GDP increase to the government. And that's all just PDVSA, that's the state oil major. You have frozen. I don't know if I can be heard or not.
Joe, I can hear you. I think Nicholas is lost, so just keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. Yes. Where was I? So the economy, it looks set to grow again thanks to this lifting of sanctions. Interestingly, on those sanctions, there was 3 areas of sanctions relief. One on oil, which is the main kind of input to the Venezuelan economy. Another on gold, which has political significance.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. My fault.
Welcome back. I was just explaining how the sanctions, how the three levels of sanctions affect the regime differently in Venezuela. So you have the oil sector, which is main inputs to the economy, obviously. The secondary financial bonds trading, lifting a ban on that doesn't help the regime or the government, I should say, in any way. But it does make a lot of bondholders rich. But the gold is quite interesting because the gold is the gold sector in Venezuela, as in much of the gold mining world, operates between formality and informality. It's very easy to launder gold, and that would, if the US were to. The thinking is that the gold, a lot of gold, those sanctions are ones that benefited the government directly, not the Venezuelan people, but government officials on the take in the gold sector. So by slapping those sanctions back on, it makes it hard for them to offload their gold. That's kind of seen as being a possible sanction that if any is to be put back on, it's probably that one, because the the secondary markets wouldn't affect the government at all, and the oil would affect the government, but it would also affect the Venezuelan people. Anyway.
Joe, can you imagine a scenario in which the government does lose power at the ballot box? And I'm going to use a parallel with the Balkans, which was when Milosevic, he had a very big control of the media, and used nationalism, as we all know, during the Yugoslav wars to keep himself in power, and it was destructive over time. In the end, in 2000, what happened was that the opposition groups and the NGOs, they ran elections and they were able to count the votes more quickly than the government was. And then when the results came out, it was very difficult for the government to challenge it. I'm trying to imagine a scenario in which Maduro or his party loses power. Is that possible?
It's very, very hard to see. One of the curious things about the sort of quasi-dictatorship that is being built in Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro since 2013 is not only what it does on election day, but what it does between election days. It doesn't only choose who wins, it chooses who gets to lose. And we're seeing that now, which is why it is incredibly hard to see him allowing this Maria Corina Machado to run. She's simply too dangerous, and he doesn't really have a kind of off-ramp. I mean, where could he go? Cuba, Russia. I mean, Venezuelans like Venezuela. It's probably not that appealing.
But you raised an important point also about the people who support the regime, the military, which is a key part of it. The people who are making money out of illegal mining, the sort of quasi-illegal economy. I guess when those people decide it's no longer worth their while, they'll go against him.
Exactly, and that's where you just have to see if he's able to continue to shore up his power base, which he appears able to do. I mean, this Essequibo kind of controversy, that's something the military wasn't on board with. They wouldn't have wanted that. If he'd pushed that could have been curtains for him. He could have lost military support over that, and so that's probably why he backed down publicly in St. Vincent yesterday. But the way Maduro is obviously, one imagines he's thinking. No one's privy to his thinking. At least I'm not. But it is that most things he does are almost everything he does and allows and agrees to and then welches on is all designed at just maintaining his grip on power.
His own power, yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, everyone, if you've got questions about Venezuela, about this current dispute, please put your questions down in the Q&A box, and so you can put them directly to Joe. Before we may wrap up a bit earlier, about 2:45 in about sort of 10 minutes time. So I want to do a couple of things, talk to you about the stories that you're working on at the moment, but I also want to get an overview of Colombia. We are hoping we're kind of coming to Colombia in October or September, I think. Yeah, September of 2024, and we had the most incredible tour. I think it was back as 2017, back as far as that. I can't remember. Yeah, maybe a bit later. I can't remember now. New government, big changes, as you said. So I'm interested to get an overview of what's happening in Colombia, but also generally what stories you're covering on. So just start whichever one suits you.
Stories I'm working on. That's always a fun one to think about, what's on my to-do list on a Friday afternoon. Well, I've got a few things in the notebook as you'll remember from journalism world to clear from there in Guyana. So something on its military kind of lack of military preparedness. Also something on something a little bit drier on carbon markets. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about Guyana's kind of oil wealth, but it's also got a lot of forest, which it sells protection. It sells bonds, sustainability bonds, and is trying to become a kind of big player on that. There's a burgeoning market for that now, and a lot of instruments set up for that to happen.
Well, one of the things I'm only just reading up in preparation for this interview, I hadn't realized what the political split was within Guyana, and you've got a split between the Afro-Caribbean community with their own political party, and then the Indo-Caribbean party. So basically two people who are essentially migrant populations. Where does the indigenous population fit within that? I mean, I see there are 10 different tribal groupings, but are they pretty small and marginal?
Yeah, they're small and marginal and aren't involved in politics at a national level. The Amerindians are largely in disparate regions. They're not walking around Georgetown. You don't see many. It's that they largely remain out in the sticks,
and would be a smaller population, and so they're clearly marginalized politically, and I imagine much poorer as well. But then, in terms of their actual population, their numbers, do you have any ideas?
I'm not sure. Let's have a quick look.
No, don't worry. I'm just asking off the top of my head.
10%. There you go. So 10% of 800,000 is 80,000.
Right. Wow. So it is very small.
Spread out. I mean, the Essequibo is 125,000 population. A lot of that will be indigenous.
So one thing has succeeded in doing, Maduro, is actually increasing people's awareness about Guyana.
Right. Right.
Alan Livingston, you've got a question there. So let's take a question from Alan, and then I'm going to fire a few more, Joe. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah. Hi, Nicolás. Two things. Number one, my question is, what kind of guarantees did the U.S. Get from Maduro related to the January election that's coming up? I think there were some speculations or something like that on the openness of the election. Whether or not Maduro will live up to them or not, I don't know. The second thing is I'm very familiar with what's going on in Guyana. I've been following it for a number of years. I am in the oil business, and I have neighbors that are actually from Sri Lanka who have very strong relatives that are living in Guyana, and they've come up here to Houston, and we visited a number of times, and they've updated me on what's going on, what's happening. And the wealth that will be coming to Guyana will be phenomenal. With their population under 1 million, the wealth and how they use that wealth. And ExxonMobil is trying to put together some very strong contingencies on how that wealth will be used within the country. And it's interesting to note Hess was associated with ExxonMobil, and Chevron bought out Hess, and the other 25% of the oil concession in the Starbuck program is owned by the Chinese oil company, who owns 25% also. Plus, there's been some new discoveries over in the Suriname part of that region that are very interesting and worth watching also. But my question is, what kind of guarantees did the U.S. get on the election in January?
So yes, just before I get to that, I saw today actually that today Petrobras, Shell, and Qatar Energy and Total have all signed Suriname offshore contracts. So Suriname is also having a bit of an oil boom. Right. But yes, to answer your question, the guarantees that the US got, well, guarantees might be a bit of a stretch word. Promises were that they would allow election observers in. Previously, they'd said that the EU would not be allowed to observe. Now they've said that the EU will be allowed to observe the election alongside other monitoring mechanisms from the UN and elsewhere. They said that something that they've already reneged on. Obviously, they said that the opposition will be able to choose its candidates in whichever way it decided it wanted to. It's already retroactively rendered the primary they held as illegal, and suspended the results. So they've already welched on that part. What other conditions were there? That media would be allowed in. Just anecdotally on that, they didn't let me in. I asked for a journalism visa the day they announced that, and they said no. So that's not been rolled out yet. So those are the main things. The key one, really, which, as I say, has already been reneged on, is that the election that the opposition be allowed to choose their candidates however they wish. So yeah, and the broad strokes thing was that they would hold the election in the second 6 months of next year.
Right. Okay. Good. Alan, you're better informed than most of us watching this program. Thank you for a great question. Joe, let's just switch to Colombia, if we may. Oh, yeah. New president, leftist, new take on that conflict, promising to bring long-term peace to Colombia. Colombia's had a rumbling war between. It's too complicated to sum up in a short period of time. But you've got leftist groups, some of whom have done a peace deal, some of who have gone back into the forests, and the president was basically promising to put an end to all of that. What's happened with that?
Yeah. So. The kind of backstory is that the FARC, the biggest guerrilla group in Colombia at the time, demobilized following a peace deal in 2016. It's largely adhered to it. Some of its members went back to the forests, as you say. Other smaller leftist guerrilla groups that exist, as do right-wing paramilitary groups that were set up to aid the state in fighting them, in fighting the guerrillas. And all these remaining groups have since morphed in one way or another into into illegal organized crime syndicates, essentially. Drug producers and traffickers, as well as illegal mining, extortion rackets, kidnapping for ransom, you name it. What President Gustavo Petro, the first leftist president of Colombia, at least in its modern history, and a former guerrilla member himself of the M19 guerrillas, another guerrilla group that demobilized in the early 90s. He was a member of that and an organizer. He didn't carry a rifle, but he comes to power in August last year, promising total peace was the name of the policy, and that essentially means negotiations with each of these groups. So far, it has not really yielded results. Most kind of infamously internationally, with the ELN and other, the second largest after the FARC leftist guerrilla group, kidnapped the father of Luis Diaz, a Liverpool footballer. And that kind of shed light around the world that kidnapping is still a thing in Colombia. Kidnapping is actually soaring in Colombia right now. It's up. The rates have doubled in the last year, and it's all kidnapping for ransom. And that shows that, and what that kind of showed us is that while Petro's pursuing these deals with each group, they're continuing. They're not fighting the state, but they're continuing their economic money-making kind of operations, kidnapping for ransom, extortion rackets, drug trafficking, etc. at the same time. And they can't really put that on hold. The FARC in their negotiations could stop kidnapping. The ELN and other groups here are too small to be able to do that. They can't, they're not making enough money for
because you've got local commanders who are just doing it to really pay themselves.
Right.
So that central control just isn't there.
Exactly, and we've seen instances where different when ceasefires happen between the government and the armed group, there is often actually more violence for civilians, more confinement or displacement, depending on the dynamics, as armed groups fight against each other and redouble their efforts against each other, and because they're not having to devote all their resources to fighting the army. So the the process, the policy is facing an uphill struggle. Also, Petro is losing a lot of political capital over this. Presidents are always unpopular in Colombia, but he's polling at 30% of people. His sweeping reforms outside of the conflict, his sweeping reforms, he wants to overhaul pensions, which in Colombia and in much of Latin America are basically its only access to capital markets internally. He also wants to reform labor laws and wants to reform the health sector, which right now is a public-private system. He wants to overhaul it and essentially make it entirely public. These are incredibly unpopular reforms, and he appears to have chosen he wants to die on that hill. So his personality is complicated. I've covered the guy. He was mayor of Bogota when I got here 9 years ago. He ran for president the last time out. It was the third time he won. He really sees himself as a kind of Salvador Allende kind of type of leftist, democratically elected in spite of a system that's out to get him. Very it seems to be quite a paranoid person. He's always talking about a soft coup that's being carried out against his agenda. Not understanding it's just not popular. And he's also and winning plaudits internationally for his stance on oil, because Colombia is a big oil producer, and he is trying to wean the country off fossil fuels immediately. He's halted all new exploration contracts, and which is hurting the Colombian economy, obviously, because about half of its exports are oil. So it's
in terms of what we do with you. I mean, I have to say, Colombia's had more impact on me. I rank it. There are two other tours: that's Israel and Palestine, and probably North Korea, where I've learned a massive amount politically, and it's had such an impact on me. We start our tour in a place that was a sort of frontline Granada, small little town outside Medellin. Which gives you a real sort of education in that conflict. So, I guess my point was there, Joe, is despite the drugs cartels, the leftist movements, a government that can't deliver, it is an amazing place, and you can actually see huge numbers of people. The stories you can get out there as a journalist are amazing, but also for us too to get down some kind of understanding of what the place is like. It's a very rewarding country.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, Colombia is vast. It's huge. It's California and Texas together. And its geography, it's got three mountain ranges running through it, three ranges of the Andes. It's distinct. Its regions are very different. Its cultures are very different within those, food, even the dialects and things. And so you really get a sense of this kind of of how the geography has defined the place, and the conflict and the intractability of its conflict.
I mean, that's the incredible thing. He seems to have promised the impossible. I mean, it's not quite world peace, but it's the Colombian equivalent of it.
Right, exactly. I mean, the idea that you could establish total peace in Colombia would require total state presence. And and that's a long.
And that's a key thing, isn't it? Because I mean, I think on our very first day we spent in Bogota, we went going to a village. I think it was 40 miles outside of Bogota, and it took us 7 or 8 hours to get there. And it was the roads were terrible, and it was just, even though it was that close to the capital, it was incredibly remote and very, very poor. And yeah, I mean, you're reminding me too that there are no highways there's no major highway between Medellin and Bogota, and there's no major highway between Cartagena and Medellin. You know, it's incredible.
Yeah, the main population centers are really, the infrastructure between them is not great. You have to fly, which of course only the middle upper class and up can really afford to do.
Can do it, yeah. Well, listen, Joe, it's been a great conversation. We've covered a lot of bases. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time. I want everyone to stay with us because we've got a lot more talks coming up for the rest of this month, and then we've got tours to talk about for next year too. So stay on the line, everyone. Joe, thanks so much for your time. It's been really fun. Thank you very much.